Once again, my name is Ian Norman, and Diana Southern's back here. She's my wife, and together we run LonelySpeck.com. And Lonely Speck is all about photographing the night sky, and that's what we're going to be doing tonight. I'm pretty stoked about it. Hopefully we have some nice clear weather this evening. I wanted to see if I could get a show of hands of everybody who, first off, is interested in shooting the night sky. All right, everybody. Great. Who has experience shooting the night sky? All right. And who does not really have very much experience shooting the night sky? Okay, good. We have a really good mix of people here. I tried to make this presentation something that was relatively mixed in the sort of levels of expertise. So I hope there's something for beginners and then something for those who are a little bit more experienced. So there might be a few elements that maybe you can't, maybe you won't get a whole lot out of right away. But I'm also recording this right now on my computer. So hopefully I'll be able to, I'll give it to the PhotoPills team and you know, maybe we can put it on YouTube or something like that. And you guys will, you know, hopefully be able to reference it later. Okay, let's go. Real quick, we're going to do a quick introduction about me and Diana and me, and then we'll talk about optimizing image quality. Basically, what we can do in camera and in post-processing to improve our night photography. And then I'll do a quick demo of some techniques that I really love for reducing noise in astrophotos. That includes image stacking, and then I'll also sort of kind of filter that into star trails, which has a very similar technique. And then hopefully we'll take some questions at the end if we have enough time. So this is Diana and me in Alaska, standing under the aurora. This is the first really great aurora that we've gotten to see. And it's night photography. The thing I like about night photography is it allows you to do silly things like this. You can stand out in the middle of the field in the pitch black, and it can be extremely cold, but you're still having fun. You're still having this great experience. You're there in a place where nobody else is, because it's crazy. Why on earth would you go out in the freezing cold at midnight and stand out in the middle of a cold field covered in snow? And you do it for photography. Photography is one of those things that allows us to see beyond the capability of our eyes. And I think that that's one of the things that really draws me into night photography. And I've dragged Diana into that with me. And it's basically become an adventure together that we've taken to relatively exotic places, but also places that are just in our backyards. In night photography, we get some of these moments where, you know, maybe we shoot the entire night and we don't really get quite what we're looking for. But then the conditions change, perhaps. This was one where I was getting packed up and ready to go and ready to leave, and all my other photographer friends who were out shooting with us had already packed up for the night. And the moon started rising and started lighting up the Sierra Nevada mountains in California and gave just a really nice orange glow on the mountains. So I took one shot as I left, and that ended up being the shot that I loved most about that night. Everything else I took before then was just kind of bland and nothing really special, but it was sort of that moment in leaving that, you know, I looked back and saw the scene and took that shot. I wasn't even where I wanted to be for the composition. I had spent the whole night near a really cool rock arch and, you know, lots of neat foreground elements. And this was just in the middle of kind of a field of chaparral bushes, but it ended up being my favorite shot of the night. The thing that I like about astrophotography too is it's becoming a huge growing community. Obviously, it stems from the astronomy community, but now it's become so accessible. The tools that we have at our disposal are cheaper and cheaper and easier to use. And this is Tekapo this is Mount John Observatory in Tekapo in New Zealand, and this is one of those towns that sort of caught me by surprise, because it's the town where astrophotography has become so centric to the tourism in the town that you can go to the local gas station and buy postcards that have the Milky Way on them. Just a really neat place. I recommend taking a tour there if you are ever in New Zealand. Take the observatory tour, and they'll let you look through their telescopes. It's pretty awesome. This is a photograph. I don't really enter a lot of photographs in competitions, but this one was selected because I had made this photograph open source. It's completely free online. It's about 100 megapixels, and I made it a copyright-free image, and it was picked up by Wiki Commons, and it was awarded 3rd place for Photograph of the Year for 2016. And it was right next to a photograph of Pluto, the first photograph of Pluto, and I thought that was pretty special to sort of be alongside this NASA mission. Diana is one of my favorite subjects when shooting night photography. She becomes, the element, I suppose, that I love shooting around. And sometimes astrophotography, we can look at the more detailed scenes, the tighter crops. We don't necessarily have to have a big wide landscape. I usually recommend shooting with a wide lens when you're new to it, because the Milky Way is a vast thing in the sky. But sometimes we can shoot with a 50 mil, something a little more cropped, and just concentrate on some of the finer details in the night sky. All of these images that I'm showing you were taken with a regular DSLR or mirrorless camera, with no tracking equipment, and all of it was basically done in the camera, and then with some special post-processing. I'm going to show you one of those techniques today. Sorry. One of the things that I like doing occasionally is trying to push my gear to the limit. Astrophotography is already something that pushes your gear to the limit in terms of light gathering. We're using the maximum shutter time that our camera can shoot at. We're using the lowest f number, the largest aperture, to try and collect as much light. We're boosting the ISO so we actually have a bright enough image to see. And on top of that, I sort of like constraining myself, giving myself a challenge. This was a flight that Diana and I took between, I think, Hungary and Italy or something like that. I'm not sure. We were over Italy, and we were looking at the window, and we're like, is that the Milky Way, outside the plane window? And so we turned the camera on it and kind of argued with each other over how on earth we're going to try and hold the camera still. And it was like me holding a blanket over Diana, holding the camera, and us trying to support each other to keep the camera still enough during this photograph. And we were able to actually see the Milky Way from an airplane at 35,000 feet. It's not the highest quality, sharpest image I've ever made, but I think we did a pretty good job. Sometimes I like challenging myself with something like film. Film cameras are actually pretty good. They're still pretty good. Digital cameras are amazing, but sometimes it's hard to forget where they came from. And so I grabbed a little rangefinder off of eBay for about $50. It didn't work when it arrived, and I had to fix it. And I put some black and white film in it and tried doing some astrophotography with it. And can actually be relatively successful with film. And even today we have our smartphones, which are the cameras that we always have with us, and surprisingly some of these cameras are really, really good. Now I wouldn't necessarily print this and put this on my wall, but it sort of speaks to where technology is going. We really have a lot of amazing tools at our fingertips. There are certain smartphones today that have long exposure capability and fairly large aperture lenses, and some of them will go up to very, very high ISO settings too. And that allows us to capture some pretty cool long exposures at night. So what I want to go into is talking about how to optimize our image. There's several facets of that. The main point to think about is what astrophotography really is. It's what photography really is, but astrophotography especially because of the limitations that we present ourselves with and the conditions that we shoot. Astrophotography is about capturing light. Anything we can do to maximize the amount of light that we capture will improve our astrophotography. When we look up in the night sky on a very clear night, maybe on the shore in Menorca, we can see at most maybe 5,000 stars on a nice clear night. Not too much light pollution, 5,000 stars with the naked eye. Most of those stars are at least 100 light years away. That's about the average distance to most of the stars within our galaxy. 100 light years away is really, really far away. 100 light years is 1 quadrillion kilometers. That's a million billion kilometers. It's really, really far. Million trillion kilometers. No, million billion. Yeah, there we go. So when we think about that light that's coming from the stars, it had to make a really, really long journey to get here. We think about that star being 1 quadrillion kilometers away, and there were photons, little tiny particles moving through space that spent 100 years getting here. And those photons arrive to the sensor of your camera. There's something special about that. When we think about the fact that it's just this tiny filament of light that reaches our camera, we realize that we're really limited in how much light that our camera can actually gather when we're in these dark situations. So let's talk about planning, about improving our situation, improving our conditions for shooting. There's a few things that I like to remind people to think about when they're first planning. Now, obviously, on the PhotoPills Camp, we have stuff planned for us. The PhotoPills team has put together an awesome set of locations and set of times for us to shoot. We happen to be shooting at a really great time of the year for the Milky Way. And that's something to think about. During the course of the year, the Milky Way's galactic center, the big bright thing that you see in the sky in astrophotography images, is not always visible throughout the entire year. In general, the season is usually regarded around April through October during the year. And in the other months, we see a different part of the Milky Way. So there's sort of two main seasons, I like to think of it. In the northern hemisphere, it would be the summer and the winter seasons. Or in this case, like I have these examples of what the June night sky at midnight looks like and what the December night sky at midnight looks like. We have two completely different sets of constellations on opposite sides of the sky at different times of year. The next thing is to think about is where light pollution is coming from. There's a couple great resources that I like to use personally. DarkSightFinder.com is the resource that I go to. There's a pretty cool app that is very similar to Dark Sight Finder called Dark Sky Finder for iOS. And these apps basically give you a simple map of the world and map out light pollution. And in general, you want to be in a place that is in sort of the green to blue to black section of the map, or I guess gray section of the map. And the darker it goes, the clearer view of the sky that you're going to have. And the final thing to think about is the moon. The moon can be a bigger source of light pollution than light pollution itself. Just in terms of shooting the Milky Way, of shooting the night sky, the moon can be so bright that we can only see a handful of stars when it's full. Something like maybe 50 stars instead of 5,000 when the moon is full. So shooting during a new moon is pretty important. PhotoPills is a really great built-in moon calculator, the moon pill, and it'll tell you what the phase of the moon is currently, and then of course you can skip ahead to see where it's going to be over the next few weeks. Luckily right now we have a new moon. I think tomorrow is the new moon date. So we're going to have really dark skies here, so it's pretty exciting. So when we think about shooting during the daytime with our cameras can do it automatically. It's pretty easy. There's a ton of light for your camera to see. It's really easy for the meter to calculate its exposure. We can just flip it to an auto setting and press a button, and we have a nice neutral exposure. But in the dark, we have 30 million times less light in the dark. On a dark night with no moon, shooting the Milky Way in a low light pollution area, there is 30 million times less light than a typical daytime exposure. If you want that in camera stops, during the daytime you shoot at 15 EV roughly, sunny 16 rules, 15 EV, and shooting a neutral exposure of the galactic center is roughly negative 10 EV, so it's a 25 stop difference. That's 2 to the 25, which is roughly 30 million times. So a lot less light entering our camera. So that means that we need to think about how to capture more of that light. Obviously our eyes do this automatically in the dark as we go out in the night. Usually takes about 30 minutes. Your eyes' pupils will completely dilate, and you'll start to see more of the night. And with our cameras, we do the same thing. We open up our aperture. We use a lower f-stop number in general to capture more light. One of the things that this can sort of lead to is the question of, is it an equipment problem? Maybe we just need a bigger lens with a big, giant aperture, right? We want a medium format camera with a 50mm f/0.5, which doesn't actually exist. And there's a reason it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because, well, it's not very practical. It'd be very difficult to design. It'd be very expensive to design. The fastest lens ever made was an f/0.7. Stanley Kubrick used it. It's a modified NASA lens that I don't know if it was used on the moon missions or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, it was used on Barry Lyndon, if you've ever seen that movie, to shoot these candlelit scenes. Very shallow depth of field, very difficult lens to use, and it's massive. And we don't want to lug a giant, massive camera around that weighs 100 pounds. So we use our DSLR. Maybe we use our smartphone. How much of a difference does equipment really make? These are 3 astrophotos, 3 Milky Way shots made on different size sensors, different size lenses. The one on the far left is actually a smartphone. And every time we step up the size of our sensor and the size of our lens comparatively between these, we multiply the amount of light that we're gathering. Bigger lens. Every time we double the aperture size, for example, we went from a 2mm aperture to 4mm, going from a smartphone to a point and shoot. Every time we double it, we increase the amount of light that we're gathering by 4. We double it again, and we're increasing the amount of light by 16 compared to the smartphone. So a DSLR with a large sensor, larger lens, can capture a lot more light. If we look at these closer, we can see that's it's okay. It's a little noisy, but the Milky Way is there, and that was taken with a smartphone. It's pretty impressive what it can do. We step up the sensor size a little bit, the lens size a little bit, looks a little bit better. So this one was made on the Sony RX100, some small point and shoot, 1-inch sensor, not too bad. Stepping up, this is a raw exposure from the Sony A7S. Single frame, no post-processing on it. So every time we step up the sensor size, lens size, we improve the image. For beginners who haven't really shot night photography, there's some basic equipment. All this stuff I think PhotoPills asked you guys to bring. We want our DSLR mirrorless camera, a fairly low f-number lens. I think something f2.8 or lower, f1.4, that would be great. Tripod, obviously, for support. We're doing long exposures. And a headlamp. We need to be able to see in the dark. And optionally, we would also have a remote control so we don't bump our tripod in the night, make our images blurry. That is optional. You can use a self-timer so that you're not physically touching your camera when it exposes. And for any of you who have not shot the Milky Way before, it's your first time, you're not really sure about image or exposure settings, if you want to just dial something in and get a shot, you don't really want to think about it. Dial in 20 seconds, f2.8 if you can go to it, as low as you can go if you can't, and ISO 3200. The reason I can give you a specific exposure to photograph the Milky Way is because the Milky Way does not change in brightness. It's kind of like the sun, save for it being covered by clouds or the introduction of some sort of light pollution in your frame. The Milky Way is always the same brightness. The stars, they change in brightness a little bit, but as a whole, they sort of average out to the same brightness all the time. So let's talk about why we select those exposure settings and how we can refine them a little bit. And then we'll go into a post-processing method to try and improve those base images that we have. So how do we define image quality? In order to sort of maximize the image quality that we have, we need to define what we think of it in a technical sense. There are three sort of pillars that I like to think about when I think about image quality. I think about signal-to-noise ratio. That's how noisy and grainy is your image. And what are the things that affect signal-to-noise ratio? A bigger sensor and lens, like we were talking about, using a bigger camera. Obviously, that can be expensive. So maybe we work with the camera that we have and we think about some other things, like using a lower f-number on our lens, or using a longer shutter time to reduce noise because we can gather more light, or using an optimum ISO selection. Certain cameras behave differently at different ISOs, and I'll go into that as well. There's sharpness, obviously, using a sharper lens, using a higher resolution sensor. These are the expensive ways to achieve sharpness, obviously. But within our camera, within the limitations of our equipment, we can also think about things like shortening our shutter time in order to make the stars appear more like pinpoints so that they have an overall sharper quality to them. The other thing we can do is optimize our aperture selection. Certain lenses are much sharper at certain aperture settings. And then the final pillar is contrasting color. For the most part, contrasting color is a post-processing thing. And so in order to aid that, we want to make sure that we have improved signal-to-noise ratio. The better the signal-to-noise ratio, the more we can do in post-processing to sort of push our images. A lot of night sky images can look fairly flat out of the camera. And so being able to do those slight adjustments in post-processing can be very important to sort of get across, a successful image. So the first thing I want to talk about is aperture, and then I'll kind of move into the other three exposure triangle settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So aperture affects a bunch of different things, whole lot of different things. It's also one of the weird concepts that when you're first entering photography, it's kind of strange because there's weird inverse numbers and stuff like that. But the basic thing that we need to think about is that a low f number allows us to capture way more light, bigger opening of the lens, but it also introduces weird things like aberrations. Lenses behave a little less nicely at low f numbers. Corners can be blurry. Stars can start to look not like stars and more like UFOs. And then as we stop the image down, we can achieve a sharper image. Those weird UFO-looking stars will start to close in and look more like pinpoints. But then we start collecting less light. and what's left when we collect less light is more noise. So it always becomes this weird balance, this compromise between choosing a really low F number but getting these kind of funky looking stars in the corner of your images if you have a high aberration lens, and having sharp stars but having a noisy image. So it's always a compromise. Here's an example of an image shot at f1.4. If you look at the stars on the corners, you can see that they kind of look like birds or something like that. This is a very high aberration lens. Not the best night photography lens, but it wasn't too terrible. If I stopped it down to f2.8, it pulls in the stars to nice sharp pinpoints. Vignetting is reduced. We actually no longer have these really dark corners. We have a more evenly toned frame. Noise isn't too bad for a base frame. It's a good exposure to start with for processing. And I would call that a fairly successful starting image. Just to sort of go one step further, if I stop down a few more stops and go to f8, the stars look even more like pinpoints, but we start getting this kind of like ugly looking noise in the image. So the extremes are where we end up with some undesirable effects in our images.
Were all of those at the same ISO?
No, all of these were, well,
Yeah.
that's definitely not correct. That's probably, my labels are probably incorrect. Yeah, they're the same shutter speed, same different apertures, and then the ISO was pushed for each one. So I must have mislabeled it. Sorry. Yeah, each one was probably boosted proportional to the aperture. So yeah, picking an F number, it's a compromise. Best mix of sharpness and noise. Usually, if you're shooting with, especially with a very large aperture, low F number lens, like an f1.4, it's a little helpful to stop down at least one stop. If you have f1.4, stop it down to f2, maybe f2.8, and that's usually enough to really get a sharp image, but make sure that you're not making too noisy of an image. The next pillar is shutter time. So I call it shutter time instead of shutter speed because speed is kind of weird. The shutter moves at the same exact speed every time. It's just when it opens and when it closes. Using a longer shutter time allows us to collect more light, but if we're just using a basic tripod, no tracking, no equatorial mount, the stars will begin to blur across our frame as the Earth rotates. We can use a shorter shutter speed, but we end up collecting less light again, and so we end up with a noisier image. So it's always a compromise. It's always something to think about when you're shooting. These are two exposures shown side by side, a 360-second exposure next to a 30-second exposure. We've got some actually kind of cool star trails on the 360-second exposure. Much cleaner details in the foreground. I'll show you guys that a little bit closer in a second. And we have kind of the opposite on the other side. We got really sharp stars, but there's more noise. There's more weird coloration going on in that exposure. So as a photographer, you have to decide what you want. Do you want this cleaner image, but kind of the blurry star traily look, or do you want that really sharp, detailed galactic center? So I'm going to go and show you that real quick up close. It's shutter time. So we look at these two images side by side. Obvious differences. Where I really want to show it is in the foreground. Zooming in, the short shutter speed image at full view looks like a pretty decent image. You can really see the Milky Way, but you zoom in and you look at the foreground and it's just this ugly, grainy mess, like salt and pepper shaker look. And then we look at the other image that was 360 seconds, and it's actually really clean. You can see quite a bit of detail in the mountains. There's little patches of snow. It's not too bad. You can even see some of the foreground. This is a very, very dark night when I shot. Two different images, two different shutter speeds, two different results. Going back. So Jose was talking about rules in photography and how there are no rules, and I would actually agree with him. There are no rules. There is a rule that people talk about in astrophotography called the 500 rule. Don't treat it as a rule. It's a guideline. It's a place to start. It's something to get you going, perhaps. It's a way to determine a starting shutter time. So pretty simple. Take the number 500, divide it by your lens's focal length, and that will give you your shutter time. So 50 millimeter, 500 divided by 50, 10, gives you 10-second shutter time. It's a reasonable place to start with a 50 millimeter lens. A lot of new cameras with high resolution sensors, you might want to use a slightly lower number than 500. Some photographers like using a 400 rule, 300 rule. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. What really matters is your preference. Take a photo, take your long exposure, and review it. Zoom into it on the back of your camera while you're shooting, and look at what the star trails look like. If they're too much for you, maybe reduce your shutter speed a little bit, shutter time a little bit. There's some pretty cool tools in PhotoPills that I want to mention. I'm sure these guys are going to go over it in their presentation, so I'll just mention it here. The Spot Stars calculator, this is a new update fairly recently, a few months ago I think, on PhotoPills. There's a couple different methods that it uses. You can do the 500 rule, shown right here, 21 seconds for a 24 millimeter lens at f2.8 on Sony A7 Mark II. And then there's this other rule called the NPF rule, and that one takes into account a whole lot more. Where you're pointing your camera in the sky. It takes into account the resolution of your sensor, and it gives you the optimum exposure for minimum amount of star trails, just for the sharpest looking stars in your image. It's of course a compromise. Using the NPF rule, you're going to come out with a noisier image, but you'll have sharper stars. So, figure out where you want to go with your image in terms of that. There's the augmented reality calculator, which I really like because it uses the NPF rule, and it allows you to basically just point your phone in the direction of the sky that you wish to shoot, and it outputs the shutter speed at the bottom of the frame. So it's saying right here, in landscape orientation, I should use 10.99 seconds for the NPF rule. Yeah, pretty cool tool. ISO. Now this is a weird one. You probably learned that ISO, if you increase it, you increase the amount of noise, right? Like surely an ISO 3200 image is noisier than an ISO 100 image. But in astrophotography, when we're in a light-limited situation, the opposite is actually true. It's not that our conditions are creating a weird behavior of the ISO. It's actually just how the sensors work. We're already limited by our shutter speed. We've chosen a shutter speed. We've chosen that we were going to use, for example, 21 seconds on a 24 millimeter lens because that's the exposure that gave us the best compromise between star trails and noise. And we've already selected our aperture. We're shooting in an f2.8 lens, so that's the lowest it'll go. It's fairly sharp at that setting, so that's the f number that we're going to use. Since we're locked into those two exposure settings, the only thing left is ISO. So one of the weird things about most cameras is that if you use a lower ISO in these situations for astrophotography, you'll actually end up with a noisier photo in post-processing. If you try to push that dark image, that you took at ISO 100, it's going to look really grainy. So it's actually beneficial for most cameras to shoot at a slightly higher ISO. Each camera has a different behavior. This is a test that I ran on the Sony A7S, and I shot at all the different ISOs between 1600 and it's really high at 409,600. Nobody's going to shoot at that high ISO, I hope. But one of the things that's interesting about it is they look pretty similar. They don't look like that previous example. They all look pretty much close. But if we look closer, we can look at ISO 1600. It's actually a little bit noisier in the shadows. There's kind of this like red blotchy noise in there. And that's because the A7S actually changes the way that it amplifies the electrical signals in the camera, and it brings the data, it brings the level of the data above what they call the noise floor of the sensor. I won't get too technical. But basically, that means that once we step it up above ISO 1600, the images in the dark, in dark sky shooting conditions, become a little bit cleaner. So that's kind of the sweet spot for that camera. And the way, the reason that we want to do this is so we can test what our camera does. Most of your cameras have probably been tested. There's a couple resources. When I do a camera review on Lonely Speck, I like to do this test. DP Review actually does ISO invariance tests on their cameras too, so you can see how they behave. But an ISO invariance test is basically where we shoot at a fixed shutter speed, fixed aperture, and then we just vary our ISO. But that's the only thing that we change between exposures. We take an exposure at ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400, and all the way up. And then in post-processing, we compare those images. Now, the ISO 100 image, when you first look at it, it's going to be obviously darker than the ISO 3200 image. So what we do is we equalize them in post-processing. Photoshop has a really quick way of doing this. It's Option Shift Command M, or alternate Shift Control M on a PC. And you can also go to, I think, image or photo, develop settings, and then match exposures. And that'll bring all the exposures in post-processing together so that they look the same. So you can sort of scrutinize the data a little bit better. And that'll allow us to see small differences in ISO settings or in ISO settings for any given camera. So that's why I usually recommend, if you're just starting out, use ISO 3200 or so. Most modern cameras are actually very good at ISO 3200. There are some downsides to using a high ISO, and I want to show that really quickly. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I recently tested out this new camera called the Pentax K1 Mark II. I did an ISO invariance test on it, took all these exposures, and I've equalized them in Photoshop or in Lightroom already. And this is the ISO 100 image. It's pretty cruddy. It has a ton of weird red noise. As soon as I step up to ISO 200, it actually doesn't look that great. My screen looks a little bit better. I don't know what the projector's doing. But at ISO 200, the really bad red noise starts to go away. And as we step up, the sort of grainy banding starts to go away, and the images start to look a little bit better. And then as soon as we get up past ISO 400, every consecutive image tends to look pretty much the same. We're at ISO 3200, ISO 6400, ISO 12800. They all look the same. ISO 25600, pretty much identical. So this is a relatively ISO invariant camera. ISO settings don't matter a whole lot once you get up above about ISO 200. Now there's a problem if we boost the ISO a little bit too much. We start to lose dynamic range. If we boost it up really high, we start losing highlight detail. Looking here, this is the Lagoon Nebula near the galactic center. And once we get up to ISO 102,000, 400, the Lagoon Nebula starts blowing out to white. We lose some of this pink detail in Lagoon Nebula, and we just kind of lose that detail there. So there is a point at which boosting your ISO is detrimental. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Are you doing any custom white balances, or are these all auto?
These were all matched on white balance. They're set to daylight or something like that. Yeah. The projector is giving a very overly saturated image right now. I apologize for that. I'm not sure if we could change that or not. Yeah, it looks a little bit more neutral on my computer, but these are also unedited. I got rid of any noise reduction and stuff. Yeah.
Is that feature you spoke about just a minute ago about showing the differences across the images. Is that something you can show quickly now? Or?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, so real quick. So if I take all of these images here, I'm going to just select all of them, and I'm going to reset their develop settings. Let me do that here. I'll just right-click, develop settings, reset, show you what they look like more straight out of the camera. Okay, so this is what we would expect with different ISO settings, right? We got the overblown one that was shot at ISO 200,000, and then going down from there, ISO 100,000, ISO 51,000, 25,600, 12,800, 6,400, you know, and then all the way down until our image basically looks black. And so I'll go ahead and use these ones since they're kind of more visible here. So if I select all of these images and I hit Command Option Shift M, or I'm sorry, yeah, Command Option Shift M, it tries to equalize the exposures. Let me go ahead and select a different one. So I'm going to select, I have all of them selected, and then I also select this one so it's a little bit brighter. I don't know if you can see that, how the grid is slightly brighter. And do that keystroke. And then it tries to make all of them the same exposure.
What was the last key?
M for match, like match exposures. Yeah. You can also get to it through Photo, Develop Settings, and it's all the way on the bottom here, Match Total Exposures. So it's how I test a new camera, just to see how it behaves, see where I like the ISO settings. Okay, I'm running a little bit slow here, so I'm going to try to get through the rest of my presentation. So just as a reminder for you guys tonight, if you're just starting out, you don't know where to start, you maybe haven't talked to a master yet, 20 seconds, f2.8, ISO 3200, great place to start. You'll get an image for sure. You know, take your lens cap off. Yeah.
If you had to sort of set a white balance for that, is there anyone you particularly choose? Just to...
Yeah. So I was just about to say that.
Sorry.
For white balance, I've recommended different things over the last few years, but I've sort of settled on just setting it to daylight. Daylight white balance, it kind of gives you a little bit of an orange glow, especially if there's some light pollution. But it's neutral enough on the scale that it's pretty easy to correct in post-processing. You don't have to push the sliders a whole lot. That's about 5,000 Kelvin if you like using Kelvin white balance. You can adjust it, you know, in camera as you're shooting if you think that it looks better. That's fine. Just shoot in RAW. You can always change it later in post-processing. So yeah, I use daylight white balance usually. And the reason I don't use auto white balance is usually if I'm doing like a time lapse or a stack, I want all of my images to be made exactly the same. And sometimes a cloud will come in and change the white balance, or somebody will shine a light and your camera will try to recalculate the white balance, and it's really bad at calculating the white balance in the dark. Some cameras have different methods. Some will actually look at the previous photo that you had made in order to influence how it calculates the white balance. So any sort of element that would sort of influence the result of your photo could change the white balance. So it's better to set a manual one. Some other settings to think about, and this will make a big difference when you guys are shooting tonight. Long exposure noise reduction can be a huge pain in the butt. It's helpful sometimes, but for the most part, I like to keep it off. Our modern cameras that we're all using are pretty good at night. It's not going to be particularly warm outside, so we're not going to worry about heat introducing more noise into our images. So long exposure noise reduction, keep that off. The reason I say that is because it doubles your exposure time. If you shoot a 20-second exposure, you're going to actually have to wait 40 seconds before you can shoot again. Because your camera actually takes one exposure of the sky or your scene, and it takes a second exposure of the dark and subtracts it from your original exposure. So it actually does some extra processing, and that takes extra time in camera. We can do that in post-processing, and that's when I like to do it personally. So you can save your time while you're shooting. You know, the conditions could be changing, and you'll have more time to shoot if you have it disabled. High ISO noise reduction. This may or may not matter if you're shooting on RAW, depending on your camera. I like to keep it off because noise reduction in Lightroom or in Photoshop or whatever software suite you're using, like Nik Define or something like that, they are way better at doing noise reduction than what your camera does inside of it. Image stabilization, if you're shooting on an IS, OS, VR, whatever, image stabilized lens, turn that off, especially DSLRs that have, or lenses that have built-in image stabilization. They tend to move around while you're shooting. If you're shooting a really long exposure, the lens elements might drift a little bit and you'll come up with star trails, like weird streaks in your image. So turn image stabilization off. I have found that most of the new cameras that have built-in stabilized sensors are actually very good in static situations at keeping it still, even if you have image stabilization enabled. The new Sonys that do image stabilization built into the camera usually won't actually move during a long exposure, so sometimes you're okay, but it's safest to just keep it off. And then finally, if you don't have a remote or intervalometer to trigger your camera, and you're worried about camera shake or bumping your camera when you press the shutter button, use a 2-second timer, 5-second timer, find that self-timer mode and use that so that you can let the camera settle as you press and then take an exposure without any sort of influence from your hands in there. It might be a good idea too, if some cameras have a little blinky light on them when you use the self-timer, it might be a good idea to try and cover that up with a piece of tape. I usually carry around gaffer's tape with me at night for that reason alone, to cover up blinky lights on cameras, because that'll disrupt other people's photos. Thing to think about. Okay, so we've got our settings. We know how to choose our settings. Yeah, real quick.
You have to cover if you find
It depends. Not really with night photography because there's not a lot of other light to come into your camera. So as long as there's no lights behind you, like going right into your viewfinder, it's usually not necessary. It's not the same as doing like a daytime long exposure with an ND filter where you've got like sunlight shining on your camera that can influence it. So I don't ever cover up a viewfinder on a DSLR for night photography personally. Any of you guys do that? No. Okay, yeah. So yeah, not necessary. Okay, so the method I want to talk about in post-processing is image stacking. Image stacking allows us to overcome the limits of our camera with more data. So what we do, it's very simple to take an image stack. You just take more photos. Once you have your composition, you're happy with your focus, you're happy with your exposure. Instead of taking one image and then moving on to a new composition, take the extra 2 to 8 minutes and take 8 exposures, 16 exposures, and then we'll combine those exposures together in post. What does this look like? All right, yeah, it's a fairly good example. One exposure basically looks like all noise. As we start to stack more exposures, we start seeing more details. Here's another example of a single exposure made with a point and shoot. Lots of grain. This is 16 exposures stacked together. Much better image. Here's one exposure made with my A7S. You know, you can see some stuff in it, but it's mostly noise. 60 exposures stacked. That's an astrophoto, right? One exposure, 60 exposures. So we're using the data from all of our 60 exposures, all the light from our 60 exposures. We're using 60 times more light, and that means 60 times as much signal-to-noise ratio. Yeah?
Wouldn't the perspective be moving?
Yes. Yes, so here's the issue. Here's the rub. The night sky appears to move as time goes on. So how on earth can we stack these things together and come up with a sharp image? Surely the stars should blur across the sky. Well, luckily we have computers. We can realign things in post-processing. There's software that does this, and that's what I'm going to show you guys real quick. So I use a piece of software called Starry Landscape Stacker. Starry Landscape Stacker is unfortunately only available for Mac. The reason I'm using it right now is because it's super fast, it's super quick, super easy to use. As soon as you open up the software, it instantly asks you to open up your images. Also, for all of you using a PC, there are methods to use Photoshop, for example, or other pieces of software available on PC to do these same things. I have several tutorials on my website that show how to do it with Photoshop. The process is a little more tedious, but it still works. And yeah, I like Starry Landscape Stacker. The developer has made it better and better and better. And here is how it works. So I have a bunch of images here of a pretty not very good astrophoto. Let me show you that real quick. Okay, so this was made in Mackay, Idaho, the night before the solar eclipse last year. Is that last year? And I intentionally made a crappy exposure because I was trying to do something. I was trying to make the stars really, really sharp. So I only used, I think, 13 seconds for a very wide-angle lens. And I also stopped my lens down. I wanted the stars to be very, very sharp. So I used f4 instead of f2.8. And the result was a very noisy image. The base image is, I would call that unusable. But when we bring exposures like this into Starry Landscape Stacker,
What was ISO for the single image?
I think it was 12,800. Yeah, 12,800. And I actually pushed this a little bit just for the presentation so that you guys can see the noise. So when we open in Starry Landscape Stacker, I took a bunch of images here. I actually also used a technique called making dark frames, which I'll talk about briefly. After you're done shooting for the night, maybe you made one composition, you got 16 exposures in this one composition, you went over, you made a different composition, you got another 16 exposures of that. At the very end of the night, when you're packing up your gear, you put on your lens cap, use your interval timer to take another 16 exposures of the back of your lens cap with the same exposure settings that you're using during the night. Take 16 dark frames of nothing. And then you can pull those into your stacking process later. And what that does is it essentially records the noise profile, the fixed noise pattern on your sensor. All the hot pixels, all the pixels that are not behaving, and then it allows you to subtract that from your image later. So I have here roughly 25 light frame exposures, regular exposures, and roughly another 25 dark frames. I'm pulling into Starry Landscape Stacker, and it automatically recognizes we have 24 light frames, 25 dark frames, and it's going through the process of evaluating those for alignment. So, like it was asked in the back, how do we stack these images together if the stars are moving? And this initial preview here, if you ignore the red dots, if you look at the night sky, you can see that all of the stars are just blurred away. And that's because the stars were moving. This is showing a composite as if we did not realign the sky. So Starry Landscape Stacker, when you first open it up, it tries to recognize where the stars are, and it highlights them in red dots. And sometimes it mistakes noise for stars. There's a couple red dots here. So the first thing I end up doing is kind of going in and erasing those red dots. I'll just use the eraser tool here, get rid of those. And it looks like we've got just stars highlighted with the red dots. And it has this function called find sky. So it's like one step down, we'll find the sky, and it finds the sky. It's really good. It actually will do very, very complex finding. If you have a tree in the foreground with branches branching out and weird patches of sky, it's actually pretty good at finding those little bits of sky among the branches of the tree. I've found no other program that masks a better sky than Starry Landscape Stacker. Yeah?
Is this doing it in raw image or is it converting it to JPEG?
It will do TIFF images. So if you're shooting in RAW, before you pull it into Starry Landscape Stacker, this is actually a good question. Before you pull it into Starry Landscape Stacker, you export them as TIFF from Lightroom or whatever RAW processor you're doing, and you use 16-bit depth for the TIFF file, and that'll maintain all of the raw data. So it's essentially a raw image. It just does it in TIFF format. So now that it's found the sky, we can basically hit align and save. And what Starry Landscape Stacker does is it evaluates the motion of the stars. It realigns just the stars. And then it also stacks the foreground together. So we get noise improvements both in the foreground and in the stars. All right, so there's the final result. It's a little bit better. So that's Starry Landscape Stacker, and that's what stacking can do. Vastly improve the amount of noise that you have. I would recommend at night, try this out if you want. If you feel up to it, if you want to take the next step at improving your image quality, take 4 frames. It doesn't have to be 16. Take 4. You'll see an improvement. If you need help with that processing, I'll be at some of the post-processing sessions, and if you want to get started on it, I can try to help you along.
What's the cost?
I don't know right now. What is it? 39? 39 US dollars. Yeah, I wrote an article about it and a tutorial, and I think maybe the developer realized that he was like starting to make a lot of money from it or something like that because I shared it, and the price like instantly went up. So I'm sorry about that. I don't know if there's a trial. I'm honestly not sure. It's available on the Mac App Store. Okay, try to finish up here. Oh, one more thing. Star trails. I was supposed to do star trails. So speaking of stacking, stacking is personally my favorite method to shoot star trail images. It's a little bit difficult to calculate a 30-minute exposure to make star trail images. It's much easier to calculate a 1-minute exposure. If you make a 30-minute exposure and for some reason it's like too bright, you just wasted 30 minutes waiting for your exposure. So when you're shooting star trails, my recommendation is to also do the stacking method. Take multiple exposures. Use your interval timer if you have it built into the camera, or a plug-in intervalometer to take multiple exposures of the night sky. Anywhere between 30 seconds and 2 to 4 minutes is usually okay. And I'll show you an example where I actually did not have the intention of turning this into star trails. This was supposed to be a just sharp image of the sort of northern section of the Milky Way, but I took enough images, it was like for a time lapse, that I was able to use it to turn into a star trails image. So I'll show you that here. All these images are, if I scroll through them real quick, you can see the night sky kind of move. Sorry it becomes low resolution when I do that, but it gives you an idea of what the stars are doing. It's pointed at the North Star. North Star is roughly somewhere up in this corner up here. So there's another program, and luckily this one is available for both Mac and PC. It's called StarStax. It's free. It's awesome. It's fast. Download it. Use it. This is by far the simplest way to make a Star Trails image. Very similar to Starry Landscape Stacker. It says we can just drag our images here. So I'll have my Star Trails demo, and I'll have all of my images here. I don't know how many I took. Drag them at 83 shots. Each of them, I think, a 30-second exposure.
Those are all JPEGs, Ian?
Yeah, I'm using JPEGs because I wanted the processing to be fast.
But it does TIFFs.
It'll do TIFFs, yeah. So you can maintain the raw data, export a 16-bit depth TIFF, and you'll have your raw data. So just real quick, Starry Star Stacks gives you several different blending modes. For star trails, the main one that you're going to use is this one called Lighten. Sometimes it's helpful for gap filling, with gap filling, which is similar to Lighten, but it'll try to fill in the areas between stars. If you had kind of a delay between your exposures and the stars moved and there's a blank space, it'll try to fill that in. It's not the best at doing it, so I don't typically use it. Lighten, pretty easy. You don't really need to worry about, if you take some dark frames like I had mentioned, you can have it subtract that. You can change the direction of processing if you want it to appear to go the other direction. I'll show you what that looks like. So as soon as we bring them in, we can just click Start Processing, and Star stacks together all of the images. Shows you the result as it does it, which is pretty cool. And we start getting a classic looking Star Trails image. Blending's done. Let's go ahead and save that, and I'll show you the final result. Let's put this on my desktop. Image saved. Go in here, and there's our Star Trails image. It's pretty cool. So that was really, really fast. And when I didn't have to spend an hour figuring out what my exposures were. I just took a regular night photo, and then I let my camera do its thing with an intervalometer. Star Stacks also has a pretty cool function. Has this thing called Comet Mode, which I don't know if I can reduce this at all. Okay. So if I enable Comet Mode, it stacks the stars in progressively brighter amounts, and it gives directionality to the rotation of the stars. So saving that image here, we have a slightly different effect, which I think is kind of a pretty cool effect, because it sort of flows more. It seems more like a, did I actually save that?
But it saved over the lens.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure. If we reopen it? No.
You went in that folder.
Oh, it went into my base folder. Let me put it back on my desktop. All right, now we'll overwrite it. Okay, so this is the other result. You can see it sort of like fades the stars out, kind of gives it more of a, traily look. And that's all done super fast in Star Stacks. So that's Star Stacking, or Star Stacks. Yeah.
Do you take like airplanes out before you send it to Star Stack?
Yeah, you can do that. I didn't do that in this image. There's like one like up here, over there. But yeah, that's one of the cool things too about using the stacking method to do your star trails is if there's something that disrupts the image, maybe somebody shines a flashlight and completely blows out one of the frames, you can get rid of that, and you can use the gap filling function in it, and it'll fill in the missing frame for you. It'll sort of interpolate for you or try to interpolate for you. It's not perfect all the time. But yeah, you can edit each one of the frames if you find something that you don't like in it, and then do your stack afterwards. Yeah.
So you use the same settings as you used for the night, so the 3200 and
Yeah, this exposure was very similar. If I take a look at it, actually, so it was 30 seconds. It was ISO 6400. The Canon 6D was actually really, really good at 6400, so that's just what I happen to use. And I think it was shot at f2.8 with a Rokinon 14mm f2.8. So yeah, it was like a standard Milky Way exposure. I did not shoot this with the intention of making a Star Trails image. Like I said, it was a time lapse of the northern part of the Milky Way.
and how frequently?
As frequently as the camera would allow. So it was a 30-second image. I probably gave it about maybe 4 to 6 seconds between exposures to let it save to the camera. The 6D is not the fastest camera on the market, so it needs a little bit of time to write to the memory card, and then it would take its consecutive exposures. Yeah, I think probably maybe 36-second interval to allow for the saving of the image for the camera. If you do it too fast, it's possible the camera could be a little bit locked up when it tries to take the next exposure if it's still saving. So it's always good to give it a little bit of buffer, 6
So you don't
seconds.
hit spaces?
You do. If you're shooting a very wide image too, and I don't know if this has an example visible. Oops, So if we look in the extremes of the image, we can actually see the individual exposures. The gap filling function in star stacks, we'll try to fill that in. Like I said, it doesn't work all that great. If you want to minimize the amount of gapping that you have, you can shoot your base exposures with longer exposures. That can tend to help so that instead of using a 30-second exposure, maybe try for 2 minutes for each exposure. But ultimately, gapping is something that you'll definitely encounter. And the only really great way to get over that is either you try to use the gap filling function in star stacks, check that box and see what it does. You can adjust the sliders for it. It depends on your image, like how to set it. So you have to sort of tune it, I guess, depending on your image. Or have a camera that just shoots faster memory card, try to minimize that delay, maybe try to close the margins a little bit on the interval. So one of the last things that I wanted to show you guys too,
One question, in order to get a full circle,
Yeah.
or as much as a full circle as possible, how long?
Well, if you wanted a full circle, you'd probably have to be in Iceland on December 21st, or maybe not even Iceland, maybe like the North Pole on December 21st, and then shoot a 24-hour time lapse to get a true full circle, right? Because that's how long it takes for the Earth to rotate a full circle. But if you want sort of just the effect of a full circle, which I think maybe you're asking about, you can probably just shoot for 30 minutes to kind of really have that star trails look. Let me zoom out on this one.
Depends on the direction of where you're shooting though, 'cause if
Right.
you're far from the Polaris,
Yeah.
like the North Pole or the South Pole.
You can check it in PhotoPills, actually.
Yeah.
There's a pill for it.
Yeah, there's a pill for that. There's a pill for that. Yeah, there's the Star Trails pill. Enter in how many degrees of rotation you want, and it'll tell you exactly how long you need to shoot.
Yeah, this is PhotoPills Camp.
Yeah. But yeah, if you aren't pointed at the North Star, then you won't get that circle effect. You'll get some sort of other shape. If it's near what they call the celestial equator, you can get straight lines. Sometimes if it's a very wide angle, you get some straight lines in the center and some curved lines on the bottom and some curved lines on the top. So there's some different shapes that you can work with depending on where you're pointing your camera in the sky. Do I need to end? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and transition. Mark G is coming up next, and he's going to be talking about panorama stitching, and this is like the last final post-processing and shooting method that I like to reduce noise. Panorama stitching takes advantage of I guess it takes advantage of data in a different way. By shooting a panorama stitch, we can utilize longer lenses. And one of the things that comes with longer lenses is larger physical apertures. Something like a 50 millimeter f1.4 has a very, very large opening and collects a lot of light. So we're capable of gathering significantly more light with a 50 millimeter lens, but we end up with a very narrow field of view of the sky. So the only way to overcome that is to stitch a bunch of frames together so that we increase our field of view. And that's what Mark G is going to be talking about. I highly recommend trying a panorama stitch. They're super fun. The results can be amazing. Depending on what type of lens you use, you get different types of effects. This example here, was made on a 50 millimeter lens, and it has the equivalent field of view of about 24 millimeters if you cropped it to square. It just has, significantly finer detail, less noise than what I would have gotten had I used just a regular 24 millimeter lens.
How many frames? How many panels?
This is 11 frames. It was like an odd number. I didn't have a pano head or anything like that. I kind of just used my tripod ball head and try to figure it out. It's 3 rows. It's roughly 3 by 3. It ended up being more like 4 by 4 by 5. I don't know. It was kind of a weird stitch. I cropped it afterward to get rid of the weird corners, but that was the final result. This is another example of pano stitching. It's a lot redder on that screen. So I wanted to end with a quote by Carl Sagan, and this is where our website name comes from. This is part of the Pale Blue Dot, a vision of the human future in space. And I think Carl Sagan has some of the most amazing prose on our planet and preservation of it. And he says, based on this image, which is in the background, which is known as the Pale Blue Dot image, he says about it, and to give you some context, this image was taken from the Voyager spacecraft from around the distance of Saturn of the Earth. And the Earth is seen right there. It's that little dot seen from millions and millions of miles away. And he says about this image, our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. And he finishes his monologue, it's a lot longer than that. He finishes his monologue with preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home that we've ever known. And I think that those are words that are very important to think about with the night sky, with our Earth in general. We only have one of them, and we're all alone together in it. And that's where the name Lonely Speck for our blog comes from. The logo for our blog is this logo on my hat, which you might see me wearing around. We just made these. Is actually based on the 4 pixels of the Earth in the pale blue dot image. It's actually, those are the 4 pixels. I don't think I've explained that to anybody, actually. So you guys are the only ones who know that, but that's why the Lonely Speck logo is these 4 pixels. It's the 4 pixels of the Earth from the pale blue dot image. Yeah, there it is.